I almost didn't check the credit card statement. That's the detail I keep coming back to, even now. It was a Thursday evening in October, late enough that the shop was locked and the sawdust had settled, and I was sitting at the kitchen table with a beer I hadn't touched and a stack of mail I'd been ignoring for 4 days. The credit card statement was third from the bottom, behind a hardware supplier invoice and a property tax notice. I opened it the way I opened everything that came in an envelope, without expectation, out of habit, because I'm the kind of man who reads his mail even when he doesn't want to. The first charge I didn't recognize was for a hotel in downtown Asheville. 2 nights, a weekend in September. The Meridian Grand, a property I knew by reputation as the kind of place that charged $400 a night and called it competitive pricing. Claire and I had not stayed there in September. I had been at a woodworking trade show in Atlanta that weekend. I remembered it specifically because she'd called me both evenings and complained about how quiet the house was. I read the line item 3 times. Then I kept going. There were 6 more charges over the preceding 3 months that I couldn't account for. Restaurants I'd never been to. A wine bar on Lexington. A spa afternoon on a Tuesday when Claire had told me she was working through lunch on a presentation. Each charge individually explainable, collectively forming something with a shape I didn't want to name yet. My name is Nathan Briggs. I'm 38 years old, and I run a custom furniture and woodworking shop called Briggs & Grain out of a converted warehouse on the south side of Asheville, North Carolina. I spent 7 years practicing corporate law before I burned out completely, cashed out my retirement account, and built the kind of business that actually made sense to me. Something I could touch, something that produced objects meant to last. The shop employs 6 people and turns a solid profit. And I am genuinely proud of it in a way I was never proud of anything I accomplished in law. Claire and I had been married 11 years. We met in law school. She left practice after 3 years to move into marketing, which suited her considerably better than it had suited me. She was now the marketing director for a regional hotel group called Montclair Properties, which operated 6 boutique hotels across western North Carolina. Her boss was Ryan Sutton, 40 years old, twice divorced, who drove a Porsche Cayenne and had a habit of texting Claire on Saturday mornings about brand strategy. I had met Ryan Sutton at 4 company events over the past 2 years. He was the kind of man who occupied a room by taking more than his share of it. Louder than necessary, smoother than genuine, the specific brand of charming that reads his effort if you're paying attention. Both times our conversations had lasted more than 5 minutes. He'd found a way to reference his salary or his travel schedule or something he owned. I had never particularly liked him. I hadn't been alarmed by him either, which I now understood as a failure of attention. My sister Beth came over for dinner that Friday, 2 days after I found the statement. She and Claire had always gotten along. Beth was warm and direct and didn't carry social complications, and Claire had always seemed comfortable with her. But somewhere in the middle of the meal, Beth said something that lodged itself in my chest. She said, "Nathan, I don't know how to say this exactly, but Claire seems different lately. More distracted maybe. Or somewhere else." Claire was in the kitchen refilling wine glasses. I looked at Beth and said, "Different how?" She shook her head. "I don't know, just somewhere else." That phrase stayed with me after Beth left and after Claire went to bed, and after I sat on the back porch with the untouched beer that had become something of a pattern, somewhere else. I had noticed it too, I realized. The phone always with her, the screen dimming before I could see it, the easy explanations that answered every surface question while somehow leaving everything underneath unaddressed. I was a corporate attorney for 7 years. I spent those years reading documents and depositions and discovering the points where a narrative broke down under examination. The credit card charges were a narrative that didn't hold. On a Saturday morning, when Claire told me she had a department meeting, I did 2 things. First, I opened her laptop, which she'd left on the kitchen counter. Her password was our wedding anniversary date. She'd used it for everything as long as I'd known her. I found her email, which told me less than I expected, because she'd clearly been careful about what she said in writing. But I found her calendar, which told me considerably more. The entries labeled Sutton. Strategy sync occurred 14 times in the preceding 4 months. 8 of them were scheduled during hours when I knew she was telling me she was somewhere else. Second, I called a woman named Diane Reyes, who ran a small investigations practice out of a 1-room office on Merriman Avenue. I'd referred clients to her twice during my law practice days, when they needed documentation for litigation. She was precise and discreet and did not ask unnecessary questions. I told her I needed to know the nature of my wife's relationship with her employer. Diane said she'd have a preliminary report within 10 days. Those 10 days were the most sustained performance of my life. I came home at my normal time. I cooked dinner twice. I asked about her work with the same casual interest I'd always shown. I listened to the answers, which were smooth and practiced and completely comfortable in the way that lies become when they've been told enough times to feel like truth. What I was actually doing during those 10 days was remembering. I was going back through the past several months with the particular attention that I'd failed to give them in real time, and I was seeing things that had been visible all along. The Sunday morning phone calls from Ryan that I'd been told were operational emergencies. The way she'd taken to keeping her phone face down on the nightstand, even when she was asleep, a habit she'd never had before. The weekend in July when she'd gone to Charlotte for what she described as a brand partnership meeting, and I'd noticed afterward that she'd packed the gray dress she only wore when she wanted to look a certain way. I thought about how often she'd mentioned Ryan's name in the preceding year, not constantly, but with a regularity that I'd accepted as professional context and was now rereading as something practiced. The casual frequency of it, the way his name arrived just often enough to seem normal, never so often as to seem significant. I thought about the night 3 months ago when I'd come home late from the shop and she'd been on the phone and she'd moved into the bedroom and closed the door, and when I'd knocked and asked who she was talking to, she'd said it was her mother, and I'd believed her without examining why I was being given that information before I'd asked for it. Diane's report arrived on a Wednesday evening. She delivered it in person, a manila folder containing 14 printed pages and a USB drive. I sat in her office and read through it while she waited. The relationship had been ongoing for approximately 8 months, according to the documentation Diane had been able to compile. Hotel check-ins, corroborated by reservation records she'd obtained through legitimate means. Photographs taken at 3 separate restaurants. Cell phone location data, which she'd accessed through methods she described only as industry standard and did not elaborate on. And one piece of information that I had not expected and that changed the shape of everything I thought I was looking at. Claire had met twice in private with a family law attorney named Gregory Park, who was known locally for his work in high-asset divorce proceedings. She wasn't just having an affair, she was planning the next step. I drove home that evening through the familiar streets of Asheville with the manila folder on my passenger seat and the particular cold clarity that I recognized from the worst moments of my law career. The moments when the evidence in a case was unambiguous and you had to stop hoping it would resolve into something less damaging and start dealing with what was actually true. I made dinner. I asked about her day. She told me about a brand rollout that was going well, and I listened, and I passed the bread, and I did not say a single word about Diane Reyes, or the folder, or the attorney named Gregory Park. I had been a corporate attorney. I knew what happened when you moved too early. I was going to do this correctly. The first call I made the next morning was to my own attorney, not a divorce attorney, my business attorney, a man named Clark Howell, who had handled Briggs & Grains Incorporation and contracts since I'd opened the shop 5 years earlier. Clark was meticulous and unsentimental and had the particular gift of telling clients things they didn't want to hear without softening them into ambiguity. I told him what I'd found and what I suspected Claire was preparing to do. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he said, "Nathan, the business is your primary asset. Tell me about the ownership structure," I told him. Briggs & Grain was incorporated as an LLC in my name alone, founded 2 years before Claire and I married, with capital from my personal savings and the retirement account I'd liquidated when I left the firm. Claire had no formal ownership stake. Her name wasn't on the operating agreement. She hadn't contributed capital. She hadn't signed any partnership documents. The shop's growth over 5 years had been funded entirely by retained earnings and a small business loan in my name. Clark said, "That's a favorable position, but if she files in North Carolina and argues that the business appreciated in value during the marriage, she may have a claim on the appreciation, not the underlying asset. We need to document the value at the time of the marriage versus the current value clearly and defensibly." He recommended a business valuation performed immediately before any proceedings were initiated to establish a clean baseline. He also recommended that I begin separating my personal finances from anything joint, carefully, legally, in a way that protected me without triggering anything that might signal I was preparing. I did all of it over the following 2 weeks. While I was doing it, Diane Reyes was continuing to build the documentation file. What she found in those 2 weeks changed the shape of the story again. She had been watching Ryan Sutton's professional conduct as part of her investigation, his movements, his schedule, his interactions at the hotels he oversaw. And what she found was that Ryan's relationship with Claire was not only personal, but potentially financial in a way that I hadn't anticipated. Montclair Properties ran marketing budgets through individual hotels, each allocated quarterly by the regional office that Ryan controlled. Diane had obtained, through a source she did not identify, copies of 3 vendor invoices submitted through Claire's department over the preceding 6 months. 2 of the vendors, a digital marketing consultancy and a content production company, had addresses that corresponded to mailbox rental services. When Diane ran their registration records, both companies had been incorporated less than a year ago, and neither had a discoverable online presence, client roster, or body of work. The invoices totaled $240,000, billed over 6 months. Diane said, "When she presented this, I want to be clear about what I can and can't confirm. I can confirm the vendors appear to be shell entities. I can confirm the invoices were processed through your wife's department. I cannot confirm with certainty where the money went after it left Montclair Properties. But the pattern is consistent with inflated vendor billing used to extract funds from a corporate budget." I sat with that for a moment. Then I said, "So the affair might be the least of what's happening here." She said, "That's my read." I drove home that night and sat in my workshop long after the lights in the house had gone off, surrounded by half-finished furniture and the smell of sawdust and wood oil. I thought about the 11 years of my marriage and what they were actually made of, and whether any of the architecture I'd believed in was real. I'm not going to tell you I didn't feel any of it. I felt all of it. The specific grief of understanding that someone you built a life with was building a separate one alongside it, and the particular cold fury of realizing that the scale of what was being done to you was larger than you had understood. But I'd spent 7 years in corporate law, watching people make the mistake of letting what they felt drive what they did next, and I had no intention of making that error. I opened my laptop and started a document. I labeled it Documentation, Briggs. I began transferring everything I had: Diane's reports, the credit card statements, the calendar screenshots, the business records Clark had requested, into a single organized file. Then I made a decision that I had been considering for several days. I was going to find out what Ryan Sutton knew about the shell vendors, and whether his version of events would match Claire's. I arranged this through a contact I still had from my law firm days, a man named Paul Garrett who did due diligence work for a private equity group that occasionally used Briggs and Grain furniture for their office renovations. Paul knew Ryan Sutton professionally through the hotel industry and agreed, as a favor, to have a casual lunch with him and mention the vendor situation obliquely, not accusatorially, just in the context of a general conversation about vendor compliance issues his clients had been dealing with. Paul called me after the lunch. He said, "Your instinct is right. When I mentioned inflated vendor invoices as a general issue, Ryan got specific in a way that didn't fit. He started talking about how difficult it was to monitor every invoice that came through a department when you were managing 6 properties. He said that department directors had a lot of discretion and that the regional office couldn't be expected to verify every vendor. He was very invested in establishing that the regional office wasn't responsible for individual department decisions." I said, "So he's already thinking about how to distance himself from it." Paul said, "That's what it sounded like to me." Over the following 3 weeks, the file grew. Diane confirmed, through additional documentation, that the 2 shell vendors had received payments that were ultimately routed, through a series of intermediate accounts, to a personal account held by Ryan Sutton. The mechanism was sophisticated enough that it wouldn't have been discovered through routine auditing, but it wasn't sophisticated enough to survive forensic scrutiny. Claire's role, as best Diane could document, was that she had approved the vendor invoices through her department and had done so with signatures that indicated review and authorization. Whether she understood the full picture of what the money was doing after it left her accounts was something the documentation couldn't answer definitively, but the combination of the personal relationship, the shell vendors, the approved invoices, and the family law attorney consultations formed a picture that was difficult to read generously. I brought everything to Clark, who brought in a criminal defense colleague named Angela Wu to review the financial fraud elements. Angela read through the documentation carefully and then said something that I've thought about many times since. She said, "Nathan, I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly. Do you believe your wife understood what she was doing?" I thought about it, genuinely thought about it. I said, "I think she understood enough." Angela said, "Then we need to think carefully about how you use this, because the moment this becomes a criminal matter, it's no longer in your control. The DA decides what to charge and when and how. If you want to control the outcome, you want to use it in civil proceedings, not hand it to law enforcement and wait." Clark agreed. He said, "Bring this into the divorce proceeding. Let her attorney open with whatever they're planning to open with, and then we respond with everything we have. The financial fraud documentation will eliminate her claims because a court isn't going to award marital assets to someone who participated in stealing from a corporate employer. And it will create consequences for Ryan that don't require you to file a single complaint yourself. The moment this is in the court record, Montclair Properties will see it." I asked how long we needed. Clark said, 2 more weeks. Give us 2 more weeks to make sure every piece of this is airtight." I went home, I had dinner with my wife. I listened to her talk about a new property Montclair was considering acquiring, and I asked the appropriate follow-up questions. And I went to bed when she went to bed, and I lay in the dark beside her and thought about what Clark had said. 2 more weeks. I was going to give them exactly that. Claire filed on a Tuesday morning in January. I know because Clark called me at 8:45 while I was in the shop doing a finish coat on a dining table, and he said, "Her attorney filed this morning. It's everything we expected. Half the marital assets, a claim on the business appreciation, spousal support for 7 years. Gregory Park is her counsel, which is consistent with what Diane documented." I set the brush down carefully. I said, "How long before we respond?" Clark said, "I want to give them 3 days to feel confident. Then we respond." The preliminary hearing was set for 2 weeks out. In those 2 weeks, I did something I had been thinking about since Angela Wu had made her point about controlling the outcome, rather than handing it to law enforcement. I contacted Montclair Properties directly, not their attorneys, their CFO, a woman named Sandra Pierce who had been with the company for 15 years and whom I was able to reach through a mutual contact in Asheville's business community. I told her that I had come into possession of documentation during the course of my personal legal proceedings that I believed was relevant to the company's financial integrity, and that I wanted to ensure the appropriate people had access to it before it became part of a public court record. Sandra Pierce arranged a meeting for the following afternoon. I brought everything: the vendor registration records, the invoice documentation, the routing analysis Diane had commissioned from a forensic accountant Clark had brought in, the bank records showing the terminal destination of the funds. Sandra Pierce read through it in silence for 40 minutes. Then she called their general counsel from her office phone without leaving the room. I left that meeting knowing that whatever happened in the divorce proceeding, Ryan Sutton's professional situation had just changed irrevocably. The preliminary hearing happened on a Thursday morning. Gregory Park opened for Claire, presenting a straightforward marital asset division framework: the house, the joint accounts, and the business appreciation claim, which he valued at approximately $400,000 based on a valuation his office had commissioned. Clark waded through all of it. Then he requested the floor and began presenting our response. The first document he introduced was the business valuation establishing the premarital baseline, a clean number showing what Briggs & Grain had been worth at the time of our marriage, before Claire was involved in any capacity. The appreciation claim, when measured against that baseline and the investment structures Clark had prepared, reduced to a figure significantly smaller than Park had presented. The second set of documents Clark introduced were the hotel vendor invoices. Park objected on relevance grounds. Clark explained the relevance in 2 sentences. The documentation established that the opposing party had participated in a scheme to divert corporate funds for personal benefit during the marriage, that this conduct bore directly on her credibility and on the court's equitable assessment of her claims, and that it was additionally relevant because some of the diverted funds had been used to pay for travel and accommodation expenses related to her extramarital relationship, which was itself documented in the third set of materials Clark was about to introduce. The judge overruled Park's objection. What followed took approximately 40 minutes, and I'm going to describe it briefly rather than in detail because the specific content belongs to the legal record and not to this account. Clark presented the vendor documentation. He presented Diane's investigative report. He presented the routing analysis showing where the money had gone. He presented the hotel records, the calendar documentation, the credit card statements. Park requested 3 recesses during Clark's presentation. The judge granted one. Claire sat to my left throughout all of it, with the particular stillness of someone who has stopped trying to calculate their position and is simply waiting for it to become clear. I did not look at her often. When I did, what I saw was not the performance of innocence that I'd been living alongside for the better part of a year. It was something quieter and more final than that. After the hearing, Clark and I stood in the hallway while Park and Claire had a separate conversation further down the corridor. Clark said, "The business claim is gone. She has no credible position on the appreciation given the conduct documentation. Spousal support will be contested based on the fraud involvement, which reduces her sympathetic standing significantly. We're going to settle this on terms much closer to ours than hers." I said, "What about the fraud referral?" Clark said, "Sandra Pierce and Montclair's counsel have already been in contact with law enforcement. That process is moving independently of this proceeding. You have no control over it and no obligation to facilitate or impede it." I said, "I understand." He said, "Do you want to know what likely happens to Ryan Sutton?" I said, "I don't need to." He looked at me for a moment. Then he said, "You handled this well, Nathan." I didn't answer that. I walked to the window at the end of the corridor and looked out at the parking lot and the November sky above the courthouse, gray and flat, and the particular color that means weather is coming. What I felt standing at that window was not satisfaction exactly. It was something less clean than that. 11 years of a marriage is not an inventory you settle and close. It's a structure you built out of actual time, an actual effort, an actual belief in something. And when it turns out the foundation was different from what you understood, what you're left with is not the clean slate of someone who knew from the beginning. You're left with all of it, the real parts and the false parts equally present, equally heavy, not separable. What I also felt, standing at that window, was that I had done things correctly. Not perfectly. I don't think there's a correct way to move through a situation like this that leaves you feeling like you did everything right. But I had not reacted. I had not confronted in the parking lot, or the living room, or the restaurant. I had not handed what I knew to the wrong person at the wrong moment. I had gathered, documented, planned, waited, and responded with exactly what the situation called for. 7 years of law practice. They weren't wasted after all. The divorce was final 4 months later. The settlement was fair in the specific sense that it reflected what each party had actually contributed and what each party had actually done. The house was sold and the proceeds split. The joint accounts were divided. The business was mine, with no appreciation claims surviving the proceedings. Claire moved to Charlotte. I heard this through Beth, who heard it through mutual friends, in the specific low-key way that information travels in a mid-sized city after something like this. I didn't ask for details. Beth didn't volunteer them. Ryan Sutton resigned from Montclair Properties in February, approximately 6 weeks after the preliminary hearing. The resignation was described in local business news as a mutual decision related to the company's strategic restructuring. A federal investigation into the vendor billing scheme was reported 4 months later, briefly in a business journal that covered regional corporate compliance issues. I read the article about the investigation on my phone one morning while having coffee in my shop before the workday started. I put my phone away and went to work on the credenza I was building for a client in Weaverville. A piece with dovetail joints and a hand-rubbed oil finish that would outlast everyone involved in this story by several decades if I built it right. I built it right. I've been asked once or twice since all of this what the most useful thing I did was. People expect the answer to be some specific tactical move. The business valuation, the forensic accountant, the Montclair meeting, those things mattered. They were the right moves at the right times. But the most useful thing I did was the thing I did on the night I found the credit card statement. I didn't act on it. I sat with what I knew, and I let it be information instead of emotion. And I decided that if there was something real to be found, I would find it properly, or I would not have anything worth finding. I decided to be the person in this situation who understood what was happening before anyone knew I understood it, and to use that time to prepare rather than to react. That's what lawyers learn, eventually if they pay attention long enough, that the person who moves second, if they've used the time correctly, has an almost unfair advantage over the person who moved first. Claire moved first. She spent months preparing a position she believed was unassailable. I spent slightly less time preparing the response. The shop is doing well. We added 2 new employees in the spring and took on a contract with